Grant Mercer stood at the kitchen window of the house he had built, not inherited, not purchased with anyone else's signature, but built, permit by permit, over 11 years, and looked at the driveway where 2 trucks sat that he had also paid for, and felt something he could not name, and had been unable to name for several months. On the table behind him, 2 envelopes, plain white. His name written on neither of them, because they were not for him. Each one held $40 and a handwritten note that said the same thing. 7 days. No card. No borrowing. No calling me. Figure it out. His sons did not know yet. They were still asleep. Debtors. Nesplona. It was 5:30 in the morning, and Grant had been awake since 3, sitting at the table, with his coffee going cold, going over the decision, the way he had been going over it for weeks. Not because he doubted it, but because he understood exactly what he was about to hand his sons, and he wanted to be honest with himself about why. He was 44 years old. He had started Mercer Roofing with a used truck, 2 ladders, and $800 in a checking account when he was 26. He had spent the years between then and now learning things that could not be taught in any other way. What it felt like to have a job fall through on a Friday afternoon with rent due Monday. What it felt like to eat cereal for dinner. Not because he was being frugal, but because the math didn't work any other way. What it felt like to finish a 12-hour day on a roof in August, heat, and look at his hands and understand, with his whole body, what work actually was. His sons knew the word work. They did not know the thing it pointed to. Nathan was 29. He had been in sales at Mercer Roofing for 4 years. He set it down, a role Grant had created, with a title that sounded more senior than it was. And Nathan had grown into the title the way certain men grow into expensive suits, filling the shape without quite filling the weight. He talked about clients like they were scorecards. He drove fast on the highway. He had never, in 4 years, asked Grant how a roof was actually built. Kyle was 24 and had been in college for 5 years, working toward a degree in business administration, a phrase Grant had learned not to repeat aloud because something in his expression when he said it made Kyle defensive in a way that shut down any useful conversation. The degree was not the problem. The $900 a month Grant sent, on top of tuition, on top of the truck insurance, on top of 3 separate one-time emergencies as sine emergenis, that had each quietly become monthly. That was not entirely the problem either, necessarily. The problem was that Kyle had stopped being surprised by any of it. The money arrived the way water arrived when you turned a tap. He did not think about where it came from, that it drowned. Grant had watched both of them at Thanksgiving, Seton. He'd watched Nathan refill his own glass twice without looking up from his phone. He'd watched Kyle explain to his cousin, who worked 2 jobs and was saving for a down payment, that the real estate market was basically broken for their generation. If Kyle himself had not spent the last 5 years living on his father's money in a 2-bedroom apartment near campus. He had not said anything. He had cleared the plates and gone into the kitchen and stood at the window and understood something he had been refusing to name. The envelopes had been ready since January. He woke them both at 6 on a Monday morning in March, set the envelopes on the kitchen table, and explained the terms. The same way he explained terms on a job site. Once, clearly, without room for negotiation. $40 each. 7 days. Your cards are frozen. The truck stays in the driveway. You're out the door in 1 hour and you don't come back until next Monday at 6 a.m. Nathan looked at the envelope, Then he looked at Grant with a specific expression. Not quite a smile, not quite disbelief. The expression of a man who has been told a rule that doesn't apply to him yet and is waiting for the exception to be announced. What if something actually happens? Nathan said. Then you'll figure it out, Grant said. That's the whole point. Kyle picked up his envelope and turned it over once. He was quiet in a way that was different from Nathan's quiet. Nathan's silence was waiting. Kyle's silence was calculating. He opened the envelope, looked at the 220s, and put them in his jacket pocket without looking up. Is there a goal? Kyle said. Like, what are we supposed to come back with? Grant looked at his younger son. He thought about what the right answer was. He said, come back with whatever a week teaches you. Kyle looked at him for a moment. That's not an answer. No, Grant said. It isn't. By 7 they were gone. Grant locked the front door, changed the garage code, and went upstairs. He sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet house and looked at his hands for a while. Then he got up, made coffee, and drove to the job site on Clearwater Drive, where his crew was re-roofing a colonial that had been leaking since October. He did not check his phone until noon. There were no messages from either of his sons. He counted this as a good sign, and then, immediately, was not sure that it was. Nathan had stayed at his apartment Monday night. He had a lease. Grant had not said anything about the apartment, and Nathan had stood on the sidewalk outside the house at 7:05 and decided that his father had not technically included his apartment in the terms. He went home, made coffee in his own kitchen, and sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He had $40 in 7 days and an apartment he could sleep in. He was not in trouble. He called his girlfriend, Sasha, around noon. She listened to the whole story and said, "Can't you just come here for dinners?" That feels like cheating, Nathan said. He said it easily. The way he said most things, and then sat with it after he hung up and understood that he had meant it. Not because he was particularly principled about the terms of the challenge, but because accepting Sasha's dinners would require explaining why he needed them. He was not ready to have that conversation. The reason. He went to the grocery store Monday afternoon and stood in front of the bread aisle for 5 minutes. He put a loaf of white bread and a jar of peanut butter in his basket, then put the peanut butter back and picked up the store brand instead. Saved $1.20. Sworn, he stood at the checkout and felt the specific smallness of that calculation in a way he had never felt anything in a grocery store before. He came home with $33.40 and made 2 sandwiches and ate them, standing at the kitchen counter, which was something he had not done since college. Tuesday, he drove to work out of habit and then remembered his card was frozen and realized he had no gas money. He called a coworker named Ben, set it down, who picked him up without asking too many questions. At work, Nathan did his job, made his calls, updated his pipeline. At 5, he caught himself reaching for his card to order delivery and stopped. He ate peanut butter sandwiches again. He thought about the $33.40. Wednesday was when the math began to become real. He had been spending $12 a day on food, and by Wednesday evening he had $9.44 and 4 days left. He did not panic. Exactly. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable than panic. It was the slow arrival of a situation his body understood before his mind had caught up to it. He called a client Thursday morning, not for a sale, because the client, a contractor named Darnell, who had been with Mercer Roofing for 6 years, and who Nathan had always treated as a relationship to manage rather than a person to know, had mentioned once, in passing, that he hired day laborers when he had small overflow jobs. Nathan had stored that information the way he stored most information, as a potential angle. He was calling the angle. Darnell was quiet for a moment after Nathan explained. Then he said, "You want to work a day site?" "If you have something," Nathan said. "You're the owner's son," Darnell said. "I know," Nathan said. "I'm asking anyway." Another pause. Darnell said, 6 a.m. tomorrow. "Wear boots you don't mind destroying." What Nathan did on Friday was pour a concrete footing for a garage addition in Darnell's subdivision. He did not know how to pour concrete. Darnell's foreman, a man named Ike, who had the patience of someone who had spent 20 years teaching things without being thanked for it, showed him 3 times, and then let him make mistakes, and then showed him again. Nathan's back hurt in a way it had never hurt from sitting at a desk. At the end of the day, Darnell paid him $80 cash. The standard rate, the same as everyone else. Nathan held the money on the drive home. Ike had offered him a ride, the way Ike apparently offered everyone rides, without making it a favor, and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was that the $80 was different from every other $80 he had ever received. Not larger, not more useful, different in weight. It had a specific gravity that his sales commission checks did not have, and he sat with that difference for the whole ride, without being able to say exactly what it meant. He got home at 6:30 and stood in his kitchen. He had $89 and $40. He had started with $40. He was going to be fine. He stood at the window and thought about Darnell, who had been his client for 6 years, a name in a pipeline, a relationship to manage, and who had said yes to a strange phone call from the owner's son without making him feel like he owed anything for it. He thought about that for a long time. Kyle had left the house Monday morning with $40 and a plan. He was a business student. He understood leverage. He understood that $40 was not a survival problem if you treated it as seed capital and moved fast enough. He was in his head about this before he'd walked. He blocks, text I 2 blocks, and by the time he reached the bus stop, he had already constructed a mental outline of what the week was going to look like. The plan lasted until Wednesday. Monday he bought a transit day pass for $5.50 and spent the day moving around the city, looking for opportunities, which was a word he had been using for 5 years, without ever fully stress testing what it meant in practical terms. He bought a $1 coffee and sat in a co-working space lobby without paying for a desk, and used the Wi-Fi for 3 hours and applied to 2 gig economy platforms that both required a background check that would take 3 to 5 business days. He had $33 and 6 days left and no income starting Tuesday. Tuesday, he bought groceries for $11, which left him $22, and spent the day in the public library on a borrowed laptop, revising his plan. By Tuesday evening, the plan had been revised 3 times and was approaching a 4th revision, and Kyle understood somewhere around 8 p.m., sitting under the library's fluorescent lights with a granola bar and $22, that revising the plan was not the same as executing it. He walked home in the dark. It took 45 minutes. He had never walked that distance before. Wednesday, he sold his wireless earbuds to a sophomore in the campus quad for $25. He felt good about this for approximately 2 hours, then felt something else, which was harder to name. The earbuds had cost $180. He had owned them for 8 months. The sophomore had offered $25 without even negotiating, and Kyle had said yes immediately. And the ease of that transaction sat wrong with him afterward, the particular wrongness of something that felt like a solution but was actually evidence. He had $47 now, more than he'd started with. But the earbuds were gone, and he had 3.5 days left, and he had not actually made anything, or provided anything, or done anything that connected to another person's actual need. Thursday morning, he was on the bus when he saw the sign, a folded piece of cardboard in a coffee shop window. Morning counter help, 6:11 a.m. Ask inside. He almost didn't get off. The bus was warm. The coffee shop stop was 3 blocks from his apartment, and he knew he would walk past it on the way home. He got off. The owner was a woman in her 50s named June. And Kyle immediately stopped himself because he didn't actually learn her name until later. She was a woman in her 50s who looked at him over the counter with the evaluating patience of someone who had hired a great many college students and had learned to read them quickly. She asked if he had food service experience. He said no. She looked at him for another moment and said he could start Friday at $6 if he wanted. $13 an hour cash, and she needed him through Sunday. Kyle said yes. What followed was not the story Kyle had been telling himself about the week. It was smaller and more specific. He poured drip coffee. He poured drip coffee and learned the difference between a medium and large pour. They set it down. He ran the register, which was a tablet system, simple enough, but the cash drawer confused him twice. And both times he had to ask for help. And both times the woman behind the counter, whose name he learned Thursday evening, when she introduced herself, was June, corrected him without remarking on it, the way people correct things when they care more about the outcome than the lesson. He was on his feet for 5 hours straight on Friday. His knees hurt. He had not known his knees could hurt from standing. On Saturday morning, a man came in around 7:30 who ordered a medium black coffee, paid exact change, sat at the corner table and opened a battered notebook and wrote in it steadily for 90 minutes. He did not look at his phone. He did not move from the table except once to refill his water. Kyle watched him between counter tasks. At 9, the man closed the notebook, capped his pen, and gathered his things. On his way out, he stopped at the counter. "You're new," the man said. "Yeah," Kyle said. Just this week, the man looked at him in the particular way that Kyle was beginning to recognize. Not the evaluating look, but the kind that suggested the person had noticed something without intending to comment on it. "You're doing fine," the man said, and then he left. It was not a significant exchange. Kyle thought about it for the rest of the shift. He walked home Sunday evening with $104 in his pocket, more than double what he'd arrived with, and the memory of a week that had not gone the way he planned and had not taught him what he expected to be taught. June had said, when he turned in his apron, that she had Tuesdays and Thursdays open if he wanted them. She said it the same way she said most things, without pressure, without assumption, information being provided in case it was useful. Kyle said he'd think about it. He meant it. There was a man Grant had noticed outside the Clearwater Drive job site. On Tuesday morning, he was sitting on a turned-over milk crate on the far side of the street, reading a paperback novel with the focused attention of someone who had nowhere pressing to be and had made a kind of peace with that. He was around 60, Grant guessed. Work boots, canvas jacket, the specific weathered quality of a man who had spent decades outside. Grant crossed the street during his lunch break, not because he intended to start a conversation, but because something about the man's stillness had been bothering him all morning, in a way he couldn't locate. He sat on the curb a few feet away and opened his lunch. The man looked up from his book. His name was Frank Okafor. He had been a roofer for 31 years, independent contractor, mostly residential, southeastern Ohio, and western Pennsylvania. He had been good at it. He said this without pride. The way you say something factual. His wife had passed 18 months ago. Kidney failure, a slow and particular kind of terrible. After that, the jobs had gotten harder to keep track of, and then the truck had needed an engine that cost more than the truck was worth. And the sequence after that was what Frank called the usual chain. Said it that way, casually, if it were a well-known road that a lot of men had traveled. He was staying at the Riverside Shelter on Main, had been for 6 weeks. He was looking for work, the kind he knew how to do. But the liability insurance issue was what kept shutting doors. Nobody wanted to put an uninsured independent on a residential job anymore. He understood it. He wasn't angry about it. He had the particular quality of a man who has spent a long time being angry and used it all up, and arrived somewhere quieter on the other side. Grant finished his sandwich. He asked Frank what his best year had been. Frank thought about it. 2009, he said, which is funny, given the year. But I had steady contracts, small jobs. I kept my head down and did what I knew how to do, and people paid me on time. He paused. The work was good. The work was always good. Grant went back to the job site and didn't say anything to anyone. He stood on the roof for the rest of the afternoon and thought about what Frank had said. The work was always good. He had built a company worth. It didn't matter the number. What mattered was that he had built it, starting from nothing with his hands, and somewhere between the nothing and the now. He had stopped putting his hands on a roof. He had stopped being in the weather. He had started being in the office, on the phone, in the meetings, and the company had grown. And that was the right direction. He had never doubted that, but something had been trading places with something else over the years, and he had not noticed the exchange until he sat on a curb on a Tuesday in March and talked to a man who still had calluses. He called Frank. The next morning, he offered him a position on the Clearwater crew for the rest of the week, with Mercer's liability coverage as the operating contractor. It was not charity. Grant had watched enough men work to know what competence looked like in a body, and Frank's body still knew what it was doing. The crew would see it too. Frank showed up at 6:45 the next morning with his own tools in a bag that had been repaired twice with duct tape and still held everything exactly where it needed to be. By noon, he was teaching Grant's youngest crew member, 22 years old, 3 months in, how to read a pitch without a gauge. Not with words, with his hands. Grant watched from the ground. He did not interrupt. Monday, at 6 a.m., the gate light above the garage clicked on automatically, the way it always did. Grant was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee when Nathan came through the front door at 8:15. Nathan set something on the table. Before he said anything, set it down. It was an envelope with $89 in it. The $40 original, plus what remained of the cash day wages. He had spent $31 on food over the week. He did not sit down right away. He stood at the table with his hands flat on the surface, in a way Grant had not seen him stand in years, Not braced, not performing. Just standing. "I called Darnell," Nathan said. Grant looked at him. "He gave me a day on a poor job." "Friday." Nathan paused. "I didn't know you could make your back hurt that way." Grant said nothing. "I've been selling his contracts for 4 years," Nathan said. "I didn't know his foreman's name. I didn't know what the work looked like." He looked at the envelope on the table. "I know both now." Grant picked up the envelope and put it in Nathan's jacket pocket. "That's yours," he said. "You made it." Nathan looked at him in a way that held something Grant had not seen from his older son in a very long time. Not gratitude, exactly. Something quieter. Something that had to do with understanding the difference between receiving and earning, and being surprised by how different the two things felt. Kyle came home at 11:30. He came in through the back, the way he always did. He set $104 on the table. $4 more than he'd started with. He sat down before he said anything, which was not typical. Kyle usually announced. He usually entered rooms like someone expecting to be received. He sat down and put his hands around his coffee mug and looked at the table. "I worked at a coffee shop," he said. "Thursday through Sunday." Grant waited. "The woman who owns it, June. She didn't ask me anything about myself. She just showed me what to do." Kyle paused. There was a guy who came in Saturday. He just sat there and wrote in a notebook for an hour and a half. He didn't look at his phone once. He stopped again. "I kept thinking about what he was doing that I wasn't." "What was he doing?" Grant said. Kyle thought about it. "He was just present," he said. "He wasn't performing anything. He was just there doing the thing." He looked up. "I spend a lot of time performing things." Grant held his coffee cup. He thought about Frank Okafor on a milk crate reading a novel. He said about Ike, driving people home without making it a favor. About the way some people move through the world without needing an audience for it. "Come with me somewhere. Tomorrow," Grant said. He did not explain where. Neither son asked. The building was on Denfield Street, a former auto body shop that Grant had purchased 2 years ago without telling anyone. The sign on the chain-link fence was new, put up the previous month. Mercer Trade Skills Center. Coming fall. They stood outside the fence in the March cold. Grant and his 2 sons. Their breath visible, a dog moving through the empty lot next door with purpose. Grant told them what the building was going to be. Ground floor. Trade skills. Roofing. Electrical basics. Plumbing fundamentals. Set of practical certifications for people returning from incarceration, from addiction recovery, from the kind of multi-year loss that left a person needing to start over from nothing but still having hands that could learn things. Above that, 16 affordable rate rooms, not transitional, not temporary, permanent below market rental. Because people who were trying to rebuild their lives needed a place that stayed stable while they did it. They assumed the building would not turn a profit. That was not its purpose. Its purpose was to take what Grant had learned, not the capital, not the connections, but the actual knowledge of how physical work built a life, and make it available to people who had never been inside the door that knowledge could open. "I didn't show either of you this," Grant said, "because I wanted to see something first." He looked at them both. "Now, I want to know what you'd add." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A job placement track." He said it without polish, without the sales fluency he usually brought to anything. Not a board, not a network, actual relationships with contractors who would actually hire people coming out of this program. Oh, no. Someone should own that. Talk to employers. Know them, not just have their numbers. He paused. I could do that part. Grant looked at his older son. He thought about what Nathan had said. I know both now. And understood that this sentence had come from the same place. Kyle had walked to the far side of the fence. It does. He was looking at the building with his hands in his pockets, and an expression Grant had not seen on his younger son's face before. Not the calculating look, not the performance of capability. Just looking, genuinely trying to see. He came back. You need someone running operations who actually understands what the residents need, day to day, he said. Not programs, not curriculum. The daily stuff, laundry, meals, basic admin. He stopped. June had all of that figured out for her shop. She didn't think about it. It was just built into how she ran things. This place needs someone who thinks that way. He did not say I could do that. He said it differently. I want to talk to June. I want to understand how she does what she does before I try to apply it somewhere else. Grant looked at his younger son and felt something move in him that was harder to name than pride. Something more careful than pride. The specific relief of seeing a person arrive at a useful kind of humility, not because they were forced to perform it, but because a week had made it available to them. One more thing, Grant said. He told them about Frank Okafor. He told them about the milk crate and the paperback and the 31 years of good work and the usual chain. He told them Frank had spent the last week on Clearwater Drive with Grant's crew and had taught the youngest member of that crew something in an afternoon that Grant had not managed to teach him in 3 months. There's a room in this building that should be his, Grant said. If he wants it, and there's a position on the ground floor. I'm still working out what to call it. That should also be his. Not because he needs it. He looked at both of them, because the place needs what he knows. Nathan nodded once, the way he'd nodded all week without knowing it. The new version of it, without ease, without reflex, but actually meaning yes. Kyle was quiet. Then he said, Does he know? About the building? Not yet, Grant said. Can I be there when you tell him? Grant looked at his younger son for a moment. He said, Yeah. They stood there in the cold for a while longer, the three of them, looking at the building that was not yet what it was going to be. A truck passed on Denfield Street. A pigeon landed on the top of the fence and did not stay. The March light in DeGrost moved across the broken glass of the auto body shop's old sign, catching it for a moment in a way that looked almost intentional. Grant thought about the hands he had been thinking about for 2 days. Frank's hands on a pitch gauge, Ike's hands on a steering wheel, driving a stranger home, Nathan's hands open on the kitchen table. Kyle's hands wrapped around a coffee mug like someone learning what it meant to sit still. He thought about his own hands, 26 years ago, holding $800 in the title to a used truck and the particular, terrifying clarity of having only what he actually had. He had spent the years since then trying to make sure his sons never felt that clarity. He understood now, standing on Denfield Street, that this had been the wrong protection. You could not give someone the knowledge. You could only give them the weak. Frank Okafor moved into room 14 on a Thursday in September. He came with 2 bags and a toolbox that had been repaired 4 times and still held everything in exactly the right order. He set the toolbox in the corner of the room and the bags on the bed and stood at the window that looked east, over the low rooftops of the surrounding neighborhood, the same rooftops he had been studying from below for 30 years. Now level with him, visible, the way things became visible. When you were finally standing at the right height. The skills center opened the following Tuesday. Grant was there at 6:30, earlier than he needed to be. Nathan arrived at 7 Zargon, with a folder of employer contacts he had been building since 8 real ones. Men and women he had met, real ones. Men and women he had met in person. People who had agreed to take a chance on a program graduate. Because Nathan had sat across from them, not as a salesman, but as someone asking for something on behalf of someone else. Kyle was already inside when Grant arrived, arranging the common room furniture with a focus that reminded Grant, unexpectedly, of a man he had watched pour concrete on a Friday morning, with the seriousness of someone learning that precision was not optional. Frank was in the workshop on the ground floor before anyone. He had the lights on. He was standing at the central bench, running his hand along the edge of the work table, reading it the way he read every surface, for what it was, for what it could hold, or what it would tell him if he paid attention. When Grant came in, Frank looked up. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Good bench," Frank said. "I know," Grant said. "I picked it." Frank looked back at the table. Then he reached into his bag, took out a carpenter's pencil, and wrote something on the underside of the bench's edge, where it wouldn't be seen unless you were looking. Grant didn't ask what it said. He would find it later when he was checking the bracing, and it would say 2 things: level and true. 2 words, the standard Frank held everything. N2. And always had on every job, on every roof, in every year of work that the world had asked him to do over and over again, and that he had done with his full attention every time. Best Sir Sissenweverger sore, because the work was always worth happen at, regardless of what else was happening. That was the thing about good work. It didn't require an audience. It just required showing up and doing it right. Grant drove home that evening, on Clearwater Drive out of habit, passing the Colonial that was finished now, the new roof, dark and clean against the late September sky. He slowed for a moment without stopping. He looked at the ridge line, the flashing at the chimney, the alignment of the shingles. He had not put his hands on that roof. His crew had. Frank had checked the ridge cap on his 3rd day and fixed a section that was 2 centimeters off, which nobody would have noticed, which would have mattered in about 6 years, when water found the seam. He pulled back into traffic, and drove the rest of the way home in the particular quiet of a person who has put something down that he has been carrying for a long time, and is still getting used to how different his hands feel without it.